They called him a terrorist and demanded he be arrested before takeoff. 2 hours later, he was the only person on the plane qualified to prevent an actual terrorist attack. "Look at him," the woman whispered, pointing at the bearded man with prayer beads. "I'm telling you, something's not right." 2 hours later, that same man would be the only person standing between 247 souls and certain death. But first, let me tell you about the moment when an entire airplane learned the difference between looking like a terrorist and stopping one. Welcome to Still Human, where we share stories that remind us what really matters in this world. Before we dive into this incredible true story of prejudice, courage, and ultimate redemption, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? Whether you're in a small town or big city, at home or at work, we're grateful you're here to witness this powerful reminder of our shared humanity. Now, back to Flight 447, where everything was about to change. Colonel Ahmed Hassan, United States Air Force, sat quietly in Gate C-23, prayer beads moving silently through his fingers. At 47, he'd learned to expect the suspicious glances that his neatly trimmed beard and quiet prayers attracted in airports. 21 years of military service hadn't made it easier. If anything, it had made the irony more painful. "That's him," whispered Margaret Thornfield, a 58-year-old insurance executive, to her husband Richard. "I've been watching him for 20 minutes. Look at those beads, and the way he keeps checking his phone." Ahmed was actually reviewing flight weather reports on his device, a habit drilled into him by 2 decades of military aviation. He was checking wind patterns at LAX, possible turbulence reports, and reviewing approach procedures. But to Margaret, every swipe looked suspicious. Every moment of concentration felt threatening. "Honey, keep your voice down," Richard muttered. But his eyes had already found Ahmed and were tracking his every movement with the paranoid precision of someone whose understanding of terrorism came entirely from cable news and social media echo chambers. The whispers spread through the waiting area like wildfire. Business executives leaned across armrests to share their concerns. A young mother pulled her children closer, casting fearful glances toward the man who was simply trying to catch a flight home to his wife and daughters in Los Angeles. Ahmed noticed, of course. 21 years in the military had taught him situational awareness, and 15 years of being an Arab American in airports had taught him to recognize the signs. The way conversations stopped when he walked by, the way mothers shielded their children, the way gate agents looked at him with that particular mixture of suspicion and forced professionalism. But Ahmed had learned long ago that engaging only made things worse. He'd served his country in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. He'd flown combat missions, protecting the very people who now looked at him with fear. He'd earned the respect of his fellow pilots, his commanding officers, and his students at the Air Force Academy. But in civilian settings, all of that service disappeared behind the assumptions people made about his appearance and faith. "Excuse me." Margaret had summoned the courage to approach the gate agent, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who was already dreading whatever was about to unfold. "I'm concerned about one of the passengers." Sarah had been working for American Airlines for 3 years. She'd seen this scene play out dozens of times, and it never got easier. "Ma'am, can you be more specific about your concern?" "The Middle Eastern man, seat 12A, he's been acting suspicious, praying, checking his phone constantly, and—" Margaret lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper. "I think I saw him taking pictures of the plane." Ahmed had indeed taken a photo of the sunset through the terminal window, which he'd sent to his 8-year-old daughter Zara, with the message, "Daddy's coming home." But context rarely mattered in these situations. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that prayer and phone usage are not suspicious activities," Sarah said, trying to maintain professionalism while her heart sank. She'd been through the training. She knew the protocols. She also knew that once these complaints started, they rarely ended quietly. But Margaret wasn't alone anymore. Richard had joined her, along with 3 other passengers who had been listening to the whispered conspiracy theories spreading through the gate area like a virus. "Look, miss," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "We're not being paranoid here. We're being responsible. Since 9/11, we all have a duty to report suspicious behavior, and frankly, that man fits the profile." The group around the gate counter was growing. Other passengers, drawn by the commotion, were starting to take sides. Some looked uncomfortable with the obvious profiling happening in front of them. Others nodded in agreement with Margaret's concerns. The atmosphere was becoming charged with the kind of tension that turns ordinary people into mobs. "I think we should call security," said another passenger, a man in his 60s wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap. "Better safe than sorry." "We're not getting on that plane with him," Margaret declared, her voice loud enough to carry across the entire gate area. "Either he goes or we do." That's when Ahmed finally looked up from his phone. He saw the crowd gathered around the gate counter, the pointing fingers, the fearful faces turning toward him. He saw Sarah Chen's apologetic expression as she spoke into her radio. He saw the security guards approaching from across the terminal. In that moment, Colonel Ahmed Hassan made a decision that would define not just his day, but potentially his faith in the country he'd spent 2 decades serving. He could make a scene, demand his rights, show his military ID, and force a confrontation that would embarrass everyone involved. Or he could do what he'd always done when faced with ignorance: maintain his dignity, cooperate with authorities, and trust that the truth would eventually prevail. He chose dignity. Ahmed stood slowly, gathered his carry-on bag, and walked toward the gate counter. The crowd parted as he approached, their whispered conversations falling silent. Some looked ashamed, others looked vindicated, most just looked afraid. "I understand there's been some concern," Ahmed said quietly to Sarah Chen. His voice carried a slight accent, the remnant of Arabic learned at his grandmother's knee in Dearborn, Michigan, where he'd been born and raised. "I'm happy to cooperate with any security procedures you require." Security Chief Marcus Williams, a former Army MP who had served 3 tours in Iraq, arrived with 2 officers just as Ahmed was speaking. Williams took one look at the situation. Middle Eastern passenger, agitated crowd, nervous gate agent, and immediately recognized what was happening. He'd seen it too many times. "Sir, I'm Chief Williams. Would you mind if we had a brief conversation?" Ahmed nodded. "Of course, Chief." As they walked away from the gate, Ahmed could hear Margaret Thornfield's voice rising behind them. "See, I knew something was wrong. You can just tell with these people." Those words hit Ahmed harder than he cared to admit. These people. After 21 years of service, after flying combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, after training the next generation of American fighter pilots, he was still these people, to someone who had never sacrificed anything for their country. In the security office, Williams apologized as he closed the door. "Sir, we've had multiple passenger complaints, and protocol requires us to investigate." "I understand," Ahmed replied, already reaching for his wallet. "Would my military ID help expedite things?" Williams looked at the identification card Ahmed handed him, and his expression changed immediately. Colonel Ahmed Hassan, United States Air Force. Security clearance levels that made Williams whistle softly under his breath. Commendations and decorations that told the story of a warrior who had served with distinction in some of America's most classified operations. "Sir, Jesus Christ, I'm sorry about this." Williams stood straighter, unconsciously shifting into a more respectful posture. "These passengers, they don't know what they're talking about. They never do," Ahmed said quietly. "But they have the right to their concerns." Williams spent the next 10 minutes going through the required security protocols, more out of obligation than suspicion. Ahmed answered every question patiently, provided every piece of requested documentation, and submitted to every screening procedure without complaint. He'd learned long ago that anger only confirmed people's worst assumptions, while dignity sometimes opened their eyes. Flight 447 pushed back from the gate at 11:47 a.m., 17 minutes behind schedule due to the security delay. Captain Jennifer Morrison and First Officer David Park completed their final pre-flight checks as the aircraft taxied toward runway 18 right. In the cabin, Ahmed settled into seat 12A, emergency exit row, a detail that would become crucial 2 hours later. Ahmed stowed his carry-on, buckled his seatbelt, and prepared for what he hoped would be an uneventful flight home. He'd dealt with the whispers and suspicion. He'd maintained his dignity in the face of prejudice. Now he just wanted to sleep for 3 hours and wake up in Los Angeles, where his wife Amira and daughters Zara and Layla would be waiting at the gate. The aircraft reached cruising altitude at 1:23 p.m., passing through 35,000 feet with all systems functioning normally. The fasten seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers began retrieving laptops, adjusting seats, and requesting beverages. For most of the 247 people on board, this was just another flight in a life full of flights. Ahmed closed his eyes and began the mental ritual he'd developed over thousands of hours of flight time, visualizing the aircraft's systems, reviewing emergency procedures, and running through the checklist of responses he hoped he'd never need. It was automatic now, as unconscious as breathing. He didn't know that this particular mental preparation was about to save the lives of everyone on board. He was dozing when the first explosion rocked the aircraft. The sound was sharp, metallic, and completely wrong. The kind of noise that separated normal mechanical function from catastrophic system failure. Ahmed's eyes snapped open immediately, his military training pulling him from sleep to full alertness in seconds. Around him, passengers were looking around nervously, uncertain whether they'd heard thunder, turbulence, or something more serious. The second explosion answered their questions definitively. The aircraft shuddered violently. "Engine 1, fire warning," Park called out, his voice professionally calm despite the magnitude of what was happening. "Severe damage to Engine 2. We're losing hydraulic pressure across all systems." Morrison was already reaching for the emergency checklist, but she knew that what they were facing was beyond anything in the manual. This wasn't a single system failure, or even a cascade of related problems. This was the kind of catastrophic damage that turned aircraft into statistics. "Declare emergency," Morrison commanded. "Get us priority vectors to the nearest suitable airport." But even as she spoke, both pilots knew they were facing something worse than engine failure. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, responding sluggishly to control inputs and showing clear signs of structural damage. Whatever had happened to their engines had also compromised their ability to fly the airplane. In the cabin, panic was beginning to set in. Passengers who had been complaining about Ahmed 2 hours earlier were now screaming for their lives as the aircraft bucked and shuddered through its descent. Children cried, adults prayed, and flight attendants struggled to maintain order while following their own emergency procedures. Ahmed had his oxygen mask on and was mentally cataloging everything he could observe about the aircraft's behavior. The way it yawed to the left suggested asymmetric thrust. The vibration patterns indicated severe engine damage, possibly from contained or uncontained failure. The uncommanded descent meant they were losing lift faster than they were losing altitude, a combination that could quickly become unrecoverable. That's when the third explosion changed everything. This one was different, sharper, more focused, and it came from the cargo hold. Ahmed recognized the sound immediately, not from his civilian experience, but from his military background. That wasn't mechanical failure. That was explosive decompression caused by an intentional device. Someone had put a bomb on Flight 447. The realization hit him like a physical blow. For 2 hours, passengers had suspected him of being a terrorist. Now, facing an actual terrorist attack, he was the only person on board with the training and experience to respond effectively. In the cockpit, Morrison and Park were now dealing with something beyond their worst-case scenario training. Not only were they flying a crippled aircraft, but they were doing it while under attack. Emergency procedures assumed mechanical failure, not sabotage. The playbook they'd trained for their entire careers was useless. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison." Her voice over the intercom was steady, professional, and terrifying in its calm authority. "We are experiencing an emergency and will be making an immediate landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow all crew member instructions." What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that she was no longer certain they could make it to any airport. The aircraft was losing altitude faster than she could compensate, and the control responses were becoming increasingly erratic. That's when Ahmed made a decision that would save everyone on board. He unbuckled his seatbelt, ignored the flight attendant's demands that he remain seated, and walked deliberately toward the cockpit. His military bearing was unmistakable now. This wasn't a passenger panicking. This was a professional responding to a crisis. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," Flight Attendant Lisa Rodriguez called out. But something in Ahmed's posture made her pause. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel Hassan, United States Air Force," Ahmed said, showing her his military ID. "I need to speak with the flight crew immediately. I believe I can help." Lisa looked at the ID, looked at Ahmed's calm demeanor in the midst of chaos, and made a decision that would later be called the most important judgment call of her career. She led him to the cockpit door and knocked. "Captain, there's a passenger here who says he's Air Force and can help." The cockpit door opened, and Morrison found herself looking at a man who radiated competence in the middle of catastrophe. Ahmed didn't ask permission. He simply stated facts. "Captain, I'm Colonel Ahmed Hassan, F-16 pilot with 4,000 hours combat time. I've been listening to your engines and watching the aircraft's behavior. You've got multiple system failures, complicated by what I believe was an intentional explosive device in the cargo hold." Morrison and Park exchanged glances. They were beyond pride now, beyond protocol. If this man could help them save the airplane, they didn't care about anything else. "What do you recommend, Colonel?" Morrison asked. Ahmed was already studying the instrument panel, his mind processing information with the speed of someone who had spent 20 years making life-and-death decisions in cockpits. "You're fighting asymmetric thrust and partial control loss. The traditional approach would be to try to maintain altitude and make it to a suitable airport. But with structural damage from the explosion, that's not going to work." "So what's your suggestion?" Park asked. "Controlled crash landing. Find the longest, flattest surface within gliding distance and put her down. We can't maintain powered flight much longer, but we might be able to control the descent enough to make it survivable. Morrison's hands never left the controls as she processed Ahmed's assessment. Everything he was saying matched what she was feeling from the aircraft. They weren't going to make it to an airport. Their only chance was to find somewhere to put the plane down while they still had some measure of control. There, Ahmed pointed to a section of desert visible through the windscreen. Former military training area. I know the terrain from overflights during training exercises. It's flat, clear, and long enough if we can manage the approach correctly. For the next 12 minutes, 3 pilots worked together to achieve what should have been impossible. Morrison and Park handled the primary controls, while Ahmed coordinated with air traffic control, calculated approach angles, and managed systems that were failing in real time. The man who had been suspected of terrorism was now the only person on board qualified to prevent an actual catastrophe. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Hassan speaking. Ahmed's voice over the intercom was calm, authoritative, and completely different from the quiet passenger who had endured suspicious glances 2 hours earlier. We're going to be making an emergency landing in approximately 8 minutes. The flight crew has everything under control, but I need everyone to assume brace positions and follow all crew member instructions exactly. In the cabin, passengers who had demanded his removal now listened to his voice with the desperate attention of people who understood their lives depended on his expertise. Margaret Thornfield, who had called him a terrorist, was praying for his success. Richard, who had demanded his arrest, was following his instructions with absolute precision. The approach was harrowing. With limited control authority and failing systems, Ahmed guided Morrison through a descent that required every ounce of their combined experience. They had one chance to get this right. There would be no go-around, no second attempt. Airspeed 180, descent rate 1,200 feet per minute, Ahmed called out. That's as slow as we can manage with the control damage. Roger, Morrison replied, her hands steady on the controls, despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. I can feel her wanting to roll left. Can you help me compensate? Ahmed reached for the trim controls, making micro-adjustments that helped Morrison maintain level flight. Park managed what remained of the engine controls, trying to squeeze every bit of usable thrust from the damaged power plants. Ground in sight, Park announced, 2 miles out. The landing was violent but controlled. Flight 447 touched down in the Nevada desert at 187 miles per hour, far faster than any normal landing, but slow enough to be survivable. The aircraft slid across hardpan and scrub brush for nearly a mile, throwing up clouds of dust and debris before finally coming to rest, with all 247 souls on board alive. The emergency evacuation took 6 minutes. Passengers streamed out of the aircraft into the bright desert sun, many of them in shock, all of them grateful to be alive. Ahmed remained in the cockpit until the last passenger was off, helping Morrison and Park secure the aircraft and coordinate with emergency responders. As passengers stumbled away from the wreckage into the desert sun, many sought out the man who had saved their lives. The apologies were awkward, heartfelt, and necessary. Margaret Thornfield approached Ahmed with tears streaming down her face. Colonel, I don't know what to say. I was so wrong. I'm so sorry. Ahmed looked at her with the same calm dignity he'd shown throughout the ordeal. Ma'am, fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. What matters is what we choose to do when we're no longer afraid. Richard Thornfield extended his hand, his own eyes wet with tears of shame and gratitude. Sir, I owe you my life. We all do. And I owe you an apology that I can never fully make. Ahmed shook his hand firmly. The thanks I need is for you to remember this day the next time you see someone who looks different, prays differently, or speaks with an accent. Remember that the person you're suspicious of might be the same person who saves your life. The rescue helicopters arrived 23 minutes later. The media helicopters arrived 37 minutes after that. By evening, the story of Flight 447 was international news. Passengers demand terrorist be removed from flight. He later saves everyone on board. Ahmed Hassan became a reluctant hero, appearing on news programs and talk shows to tell a story he'd rather not have lived. But he used every platform to make the same point. Prejudice doesn't just hurt the people we target. It hurts all of us by blinding us to the very people who might save us. Margaret and Richard Thornfield appeared with him on several programs, sharing their story of prejudice, fear, and ultimate gratitude. They spoke about the danger of assumptions, the cost of ignorance, and the grace shown by a man who saved the lives of people who had treated him as an enemy. The investigation revealed that the bombing had been carried out by a domestic terrorist, a white supremacist who had hidden an explosive device in his checked luggage and disembarked during a connection in Dallas. The man Ahmed had been suspected of being was actually prevented by the man Ahmed actually was. 6 months later, Ahmed received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions aboard Flight 447. The ceremony was attended by every passenger from the flight, including Margaret and Richard Thornfield, who had become unlikely advocates for tolerance and understanding. In his acceptance speech, Ahmed said something that was quoted in newspapers across the country. "I didn't save that airplane as a Muslim, or as an Arab American, or as a member of any particular group. I saved it as an American, because that's what Americans do. We protect each other, regardless of what we look like, where we come from, or how we pray." But perhaps the most important moment came not during the ceremony, but afterward, when Ahmed was approached by a young Arab American girl who had been watching the proceedings with her family. "Colonel Hassan," she said shyly, "I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up." Ahmed knelt down to her level and smiled. "Then you will be. And when you are, remember that the sky belongs to everyone who's brave enough to reach for it." As he watched her walk away with her family, Ahmed thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The suspicion, the prejudice, the fear, but also the courage, the dignity, and the grace that had emerged from crisis. America wasn't perfect. Its people weren't perfect. But at its best, it was a country where a man could be suspected of terrorism in the morning and celebrated as a hero by evening, where prejudice could be transformed into understanding, and where the content of character ultimately mattered more than the color of skin or the nature of faith. Flight 447 had been more than an airplane in distress. It had been a metaphor for America itself, damaged, threatened, and requiring all hands to work together for survival. And in the end, it had been saved, not by the people who looked like heroes, but by the person who acted like one when it mattered most. The man they had called a terrorist had indeed prevented a terrorist attack, just not in the way anyone had expected. Today, Colonel Ahmed Hassan continues to serve his country as an instructor at the Air Force Academy, training the next generation of pilots. Margaret and Richard Thornfield have become close friends of the Hassan family, and they speak regularly at diversity and tolerance seminars across the country. The lesson of Flight 447 lives on. The person sitting next to you, the one you might judge by their appearance or accent, could be the very person who saves your life. Heroes don't always look the way we expect them to. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight, mopping floors, teaching children, or simply trying to catch a flight home to their family. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, Ahmed Hassan's story reminds us that courage comes in many forms, and that the greatest threat to our safety isn't the stranger who looks different. It's our own willingness to let fear blind us to the humanity we all share.
Subscribe to Still Human for more incredible true stories that remind us what really matters.
We post new stories every week that will restore your faith in humanity. Remember, in a world that tries to divide us, stories like Ahmed's remind us that we're all just human beings trying to make it home safely. Sometimes the person you fear most is the one willing to save you. What will you choose the next time you see someone different? Will you choose fear? Or will you choose to see the potential hero sitting right beside you. Thank you.